Hi, everyone. We are starting the fifth session of the Social Innovation and Global Ethics Forum 2021 editions, already the 10th edition. I'm very pleased to be joined by three change makers in that session, and starting with Magnus Magnusson from UNESCO. Magnus is both, like a philanthropist, very active in philanthropy for many years, as well as a diplomat and a public servant at UNESCO in charge of partnership and outreach. And it's a great privilege to have Magnus joining us today and to learn and to share on science and trust and this partnership that is, capable to be, like the pillars of the learning journey for every citizen. So, Magnus, it's a privilege and pleasure to see you again with us. Over the last few years, we have been able to learn the project, the initiatives that UNESCO is convening to support education, science, knowledge, and the preservation of universal patrimonial. So, Magnus, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today in this excellent conference that I think it's my second time to be part of it. So congratulations, and congratulations on the 10th edition of it, which is really great. So I would just like to, first of all, say just a few words about myself, perhaps in addition to what Jonathan already said. I have a background from the Gates Foundation, from other UN agencies, and I'm a social psychologist by training. So the theme of how you build trust in science, or why we don't trust science, some people don't, we choose not to, is of very big interest to me personally, but clearly also something that the social and human science sector, where I currently work at UNESCO, is very occupied with. Maybe just very quickly about the work that we do. We try to help member states of UNESCO to build and strengthen their science, technology, and innovation systems. And we also work on ethics of science and bioethics. And within all that, really also, scientific diplomacy, also citizen science, and other dimensions. So it is really kind of a broad dimension of how we work, and the focus really that we have is also really looking at just a moment phone ringing here. There you go. So thank you. So what in this specific subject, what I would like to start with is really to try to understand what it is that drives some people to distrust science. And I'd like to quote the famous Hans Jonas, the philosopher, who at some point said that how we manage scientific uncertainty will determine our future. So what does it mean by that? And it really looks at the process of science, which is not the same as truth. It is more like the best of our knowledge right now. To the best of our knowledge right now, this is what we know, right? And therefore, we're pursuing a process of knowing more and more, and that process has been discussed by many philosophers how it actually works. And what I believe is the most adequate explanation of the process is really paradigm shifts. So why do I think that? Well, first of all, this is Kuhn, of course, that talks about paradigm shifts. But I think the paradigm shift really kind of mirrors how our self-conscious existence, our self-conscious mind works in itself. And therefore, I think it best describes how kind of science happens. So another psychology dimension is the cognitive dissonance, which is a feeling of uncomfort when we meet facts that don't coincide with our beliefs. So when we see on TV high-level people, politicians, and their representatives in media talk about alternative facts, some of us laugh and think it's horrible, and how can this all happen? Because we have in a sense a preconception of the other side or the other group that believes something else, that they are not looking for facts. But latest research around this specific phenomenon actually contradicts that. That, you know, those that have a contrary view of us just look as much as we do for facts. It's just they find other facts. So we have a mix of science not being equal to truth, but the best of our knowledge at this point. And of course, some of these theorems or hypotheses have been proven so many times, so it would be incredible if somebody comes and disproves them. I clearly understand that. But when the more you move into the social sciences or large systems like climate science, of course, there will always be some uncertainties. So how do we manage those uncertainties really determines, I think, the future of humanity. So I think Jonas is really right on that, right? So what does it take then to convince somebody that literally has found in their mind an alternative truth to my truth? Based on a scientist who has put his or her name out there and claiming this is actually contrary to what 99% of people believe. Well, I think first it takes really an understanding of what science is. So back to the issue of, just to say this is what science says doesn't really work if people don't understand the scientific process and how it works, and that it actually works in the sense of you push forward within one paradigm until there's too much evidence that basically disproves that paradigm, right? We're still within an Einsteinian paradigm, but there's more and more evidence that means we need to find another paradigm. So the understanding of the scientific process, I think, is very, very crucial today. It needs to be taught at school, also in the early years of school, that we don't put science equal to truth and then jump on our high horses, but really, talk about why we believe a certain thing is true, but also always being open to be proven wrong, right? So it comes back to the way we deal with our own self-consciousness. And this is really where I want to go in just very quickly to social psychology. We build our self-perception, our picture of ourselves in the same way, right? It comes from the people we were born by and live with as young people, and then the environment we're in, and that shapes our perception of ourselves and what we think is true and what we like and dislike. So when we get exposed to something that's different, we have a natural feeling of uncomfort, right? So the question is, how do we manage that feeling of uncomfort, that feeling of uncertainty? Are we willing and able, maybe even more importantly, able actually to put aside that ego, that part of me, and explore the new, the uncertain, right? And listen with an open mind. That's a skill, right? And if we're being told just build your personality, build your ego, know who you are, then perhaps that's not really helpful, because perhaps what we want is to move in uncertainty and learn new things and change perhaps even our mind every day as we learn more. So the transition from a stalemate kind of situation where people live in their paradigm and seek truth by seeking facts that proves their belief, to a paradigm or a situation where you actually change, or you're open and you want to change and learn, which really is a learning society, which in UNESCO we talk about a lot, which really could be in some great minds of today, some philosophers are kind of seeing a movement from the industrial society to a learning society, where we are much more likely to be open to changing our minds, but also understanding better what we want, we need right now, but then changing ourselves as we go. I want to jump a little bit over to, so it doesn't really answer the question how you get somebody out of that mindset, but there's been a lot of research around complex systems and how people can change their minds, for example, related to climate change, right? It's a complex issue, climate change, and there's plenty of uncertainty you could lean on and say, I don't believe it, right? So how do you get somebody involved in actually wanting to believe in it and actually contribute to solving it? Well, this has been a question on everybody's minds for a very long time. And I want to go into two dimensions of that. One is more the kind of emotional experience of being part of a movement, which comes back to the other dimension, right? If you can get somebody to experience nature, to want to improve the environment because you actually feel connected to it, that is one way, right? The other way is to understand the scientific process. That's the brain way, if you like, right? Another dimension of that is the ethics of science, because if you understand, I would say, that problems in the world like climate change have basically three dimensions. It's the political dimension, which is really the COP, the UNFCCC process. It's their scientists there that give their as good as they know view, and then there's politicians working out what they think politically is possible. Then you have the opposite, which happened a lot during the pandemic, where governments like my own in Sweden stepped back and said, this is not a political issue, this is a scientific issue. We will put the scientists to take all decisions for us, which Sweden did. But the problem was there is no science around this virus. There wasn't any science around this specific virus. We can only lean on earlier pandemics and other types of viruses. But then we just really didn't know how many people were contagious without symptoms. And all of these extremely important dimensions that basically determine how a pandemic evolves. Without knowing that, we put the scientists in charge, who didn't say no, and then they call the shots, right? And of course, that went as it went in Sweden. You can have opinions about it. But neither of those two really work, right? So what we want to propose, and did propose as UNESCO, is the third way, which is the ethical dimension of science in general, of climate change as well, right? So what is the ethical dimension? Well, it's one of those human scientific areas that we are still not able to convey in a good way to people, or that does not cover media sufficiently. But it's actually very useful and very practical. It is a way to look at the specific issue. What do we know? What don't we know? And therefore, what do we need to do today to have precaution? So the guidelines the UNESCO experts in ethics of science and bioethics provided to the world are actually visible on many countries' websites, public government websites, but were not used in general, except for in some countries. And I don't want to make the link, for example, to New Zealand, that they use our specific guidelines, but in some ways they had that approach, the precautionary approach. That since we don't know, we have to be very clear who the most vulnerable populations are. We need to protect them as first priority, right? Those need to be protected first. Then we can think about economic growth and other social and other dimensions of risks. But that's what we need to do, which didn't happen in many countries. So I think the ethical dimensions are important when we talk about how you bring back the belief in science, because science is one process, politics is one process, and an ethical reflection is actually a third process, and you need to, all of them need to have an important space. But so these are some reflections I have. So it's actually not true, at least according to a lot of research lately, that those that believe in contrary beliefs, even in 99% of scientists tell you this is the truth, and those then lean on the 1%, they actually seek those facts very much. Maybe as much as we do, right? So it's not that they're not factual. It's just that they've chosen, because of the way our minds work, to make up their mind first, then get the confirmation of their position. So you have to think about that as media, as politicians, as leaders, as parents, as friends, and you have to understand how that process works before you can start to convince somebody. I haven't given you the answer how to do it, but I think the passionate connection to an issue matters. We've seen that very clearly in right-wing extremism. If they actually have to meet the individual that they're hating so much from another culture, for example, or another color of skin, and they realize that this person is wonderful to be around, it is a very difficult moment for them. It's the cognitive dissonance on steroids. But once that happens, they actually are able to change their minds, right? But not everyone can be put in that situation, perhaps. But maybe they can through future virtual reality dimensions, where we actually get to live another person's life and experience it. So maybe that experience route can be at least amplified. But there are also other routes through the brain and understanding and reading, of course. So my time is up. So those are some reflections. And thank you again for having me and for inviting UNESCO. It is always a great pleasure. Thank you.
Magnus, thank you, Magnus, very much for this very deep journey in terms of psychology thinking, but as well, with a trench of philosophy and human, like a perspective. So this definitely will help, go through, this session, which is really, a pillar element, which is about, as we say earlier, the relationship, the personal, intimate relationship humans can have with science, and if that bond of trust can be, there to support achieving and solving, challenges we are, confronted with. So thank you very much, Magnus. You stay with us, and
Yes.
we're gonna add you back for the Q&A. We can bring our next speaker, if it's possible. Hello, Konstantinos. Thank you for joining us. So please let me just introduce very briefly Konstantinos. So Konstantinos, and we should say, Dr. Konstantinos Demetriades is a molecular cell biologist. He is a member of the Max Planck Institute for the biology of aging, and has been contributing in many ways to the research of lifespanning, and how through molecular cells, stem cells, we can maybe explore solutions with science being a force of progress in the expanding or maintaining or betterment of life for human beings. So Konstantinos, thank you very much for joining us. The floor is yours, and we will have the Q&A later on.
Thank you, Jonathan, for the kind introduction and for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, sharing my thoughts with our audience. So Mr. Magnusson has covered a lot of ground in this topic, and in the next few minutes I would like to bring up a few very important topics regarding trust in science, which is a very complex topic, and we definitely don't have the time to analyze everything in detail during this session. Also, as a cell biologist, I clearly don't have the necessary expertise in sociology and psychology. I mean, this is a disclaimer, which are, sciences that are better suited to explain human behavior in this regard. But still, I hope that this discussion will function as a trigger and as a starting point to make people think. So, over the past couple of decades, we have experienced, and we are actually experiencing at the moment, a very big paradox in our societies. So on one hand, science and technology have vastly contributed to the improvement of people's lives. The results of these developments are more than obvious. We now live longer and healthier lives, and we have easy access to amazing technology out there. And the new coronavirus pandemic has brought science even more in the foreground. So science and the pharma industry have responded with unprecedented speed and rigor, and managed to provide safe and efficient vaccines against a virus that we didn't know it existed a year ago within such a small time, which is amazing. But it is not only the speed and the efficiency of vaccine development against COVID-19. The pandemic, either directly or indirectly, affects every single person on this planet, which makes people even more interested about science-related topics that would otherwise not concern them at all. So we see now people all the time asking science-related questions. So what is this virus that changed everyone's life all of a sudden? Where did it come from? How is it spread? What does it cause to humans? How dangerous is it? But also more practical things. Should I wear a mask? What kind of mask? Should I get a vaccine? Which vaccine? Is it safe? People are right to ask questions. We have to understand that that's a very important thing. We shouldn't blame people for asking questions. People are right to be afraid, and people are right to be uncertain, and they are right not to know things. Because the answers to these questions and to many other similar questions are actually affecting people's lives and the lives of the people they care about, and their health and their jobs and their financial security, practically everything. The role of science and scientists has become even more important these days. So did this whole situation make people trust science more than they did before? Was this achievement enough to revive the public's trust in science? So if you use social media, you probably already know that the answer is not really. And worryingly enough, there are now several reports available showing that a substantial proportion of the public does not show trust in scientific findings in one way or another. So climate change, vaccine safety and efficacy, even the Earth's shape have become debatable topics for some people. So one would ask, what are the reasons for this phenomenon? So is it lack of information? In the internet era, science is no longer a guy locked in a lab, isolated from the rest of the world. So every person with a mobile phone or a computer and a good internet connection can now have access to all of this information. So it's probably not that. It's not people that don't have access to this information. So in my opinion, there are several reasons why some people don't trust science. And in fact, I believe that the public would trust science when us scientists talk openly, directly, and in a clear way. But this is not what is happening these days. So what is happening these days is that science has been heavily politicized. So how governments use science is a different thing than science itself. It actually distorts the view of science. So is this really what we're talking about, distrust in science itself? Or is it distrust to the way science is presented to the public? So I think many people are actually confusing criticizing government's decisions with defying science behind these decisions. And one thing that public does not trust much and has lots of reasons to do so is governments. So in the era of the pandemic, in my opinion, actions that would definitely improve people's trust in science would be to try to disconnect science and politics as much as possible. Meaning we should make sure that it is very clear which part of what people hear is science and which part is politics. And to explain to the people very clearly what are the facts behind each decision taken, and to maintain a very clear, a consistent, responsible, and fact-based rhetoric. And finally, like Mr. Magnusson also said, we should explain to the public that science does not equal dogmas. If facts change over time because we learn new things, science can also change. Therefore, decisions and associated measures would also change. So this is not a strange thing. But at the same time, we should look also at the other side. So we should educate people better in order to understand science better. So we need to teach people how to read and how to interpret science, which sources to follow, how to tell apart trustworthy from unreliable sources. So all of that, I agree completely, 100% with Mr. Magnusson. This should be taught in schools from a very early age. And to explain to people how science really works. So we as scientists, we always talk about probabilities and statistics. We never make absolute statements. We try to be honest in scientific terms because, this is how science works. Science is not absolute. So this gives us a strong disadvantage compared to science deniers, for example, that always talk in a simplistic way and make strong statements and simple statements that do not need to be scientifically sound. And these are actually easier for the general public to understand. So people are afraid of things that they don't understand, and they are afraid of uncertainties. And this is one of the reasons why people don't like science. And finally, one very important topic that I don't have the time to go into is looking in the mirror. We as scientists, we have a huge obligation to communicate our science better to the public. So science communication is a very important topic. So we should also train ourselves in order to be able to do that better. So just to close with this, I think that what we live today this is really a moment of responsibility for all of us, scientists or the general public. So people, because of the whole situation, people are listening more to science now, and politicians are listening more to science now, and decision makers do the same. And strangely enough, this also comes in an era where funding in science suffers. So you see, for instance, cutoffs with the European Research Council budget at the moment, or you see how the US administration has handled the pandemic, and many other examples around the globe. So the COVID-19 pandemic has hurt humanity so much, but it also showed us that we can achieve and what we can achieve in short time when this is needed. And when this is all over, it will be very critical not to waste this opportunity and to do our best to revive people's trust and support in science.
Konstantinos, thank you very much. The first thing I can say on your intervention is maybe some scientists should create a committee and have you as a spokesperson of it, because it was very clear. What you say was very clear.
Thank you very much.
I
take that as a compliment.
No, you can. It was very clear, and it was as well very, willing to be embraced, by us who belongs, to the general public. So this, I think, is you put the finger on something which is key, and as well, in critical moment, that's where as well we have to take the good initiatives for tomorrow. So we will speak a little bit more about that and continue the dialogue and conversation. But thank you very much for sharing your thoughts on that. And we are going to follow up with the Q&A. Thank you, Konstantinos.
Great, thank you.
Now we are going to welcome Camillo Ricordi. So let me introduce Camillo. First of all, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You are in Miami, I guess. Are you in Miami, Camillo?
Miami, Florida. Yes.
So thank you for joining us early morning in USA, and USA is in the center of attention on many aspects. We will speak about that maybe more deeply in the Q&A with the pandemic and the figures and the vaccine. But let me first introduce you, Camillo. So Dr. Camillo Ricordi is really a researcher, a professor in surgery, and as well, really a key person in terms of diabetes research. He has been as well, very much involved into new technologies relative to leveraging stem cells and cellular, therapies to be able to build a new treatment of tomorrow that will be supportive of lifespanning. So, dear Camillo, first of all, we would like to hear your thoughts, because you are actively involved into the research for this pandemic and a new achievement, new breakthrough in terms of leveraging stem cells for maybe finding a potential solution going forward. So first of all, Camillo, we would like to hear from you, and then we will follow up with the Q&A.
Great. And if I may, I'll share the screen to show you a few concepts that are in line with the challenges that we have in science and trusting science. And to me, it is a lot about the balance of innovation and validation. So how you can promote new ideas and new pilot trials, new concepts, new therapeutic strategies to come up to patients, and then how do you rigorously validate them before you can make claims, and avoiding hype and creating hope, avoiding the hype in the statements. And the complexity of the system is also because of the for-profit world versus the non-profit world. And working in an academic institution, we try to network worldwide with centers. Like I had the Diabetes Institute at the University of Miami and the Cell Transplant Center, but we have a federation of centers, over 20 centers worldwide, from China to Stanford, Canada, Europe, to guarantee and try to promote collaboration across geographic barrier. And now with the technology of telescience, that is like telemedicine applied to laboratory, you can actually be in the same, like if you are working in the same room, looking at the same microscope or performing the same procedure, even if you are across the ocean or in different continents. And if I may, I can show you a couple of slides with the share screen, and but briefly, I'd like to just show this concept. Like we've been working in islet isolation, defining the method to separate the insulin-producing cells from the human pancreas and performing the first clinical trials. But at the beginning, there was a lot of controversy saying, should you do transplantation in diabetes with immunosuppression? or shall you just take insulin, even if you have accelerated aging and complication? But then now we are publishing the 20-year cumulative survival of islet transplantation, which shows that it's even better probably than what you can achieve with intensive insulin, if you are doing it adult age when people start declining with problems of healthcare and even death. So this is the consortium of centers across the world that we try to communicate, collaborate without barriers, and we extended this concept with the Cure Alliance to all disease conditions, not just diabetes, to promote international collaboration and try to overcome impediment barriers to the development of cures, with the idea that we often wait too long before challenging and taking over a problem, like with the pandemic now, is preparedness and readiness. Science should be not come to the stage just when you have a crisis like the COVID pandemic, because years ago, when we started a decade ago, the Cure Alliance, the concept was in the next 5 years, you or someone you love may be diagnosed with an incurable disease, and the outcome may depend on what we do between now and then. But now is even more current with the COVID pandemic, because this may happen in the next few days that you are diagnosed with a severe form of COVID. So we've been involved in mesenchymal stem cell research for a long time. And then when the pandemic erupted, this is a case of conversion and rapid innovation, because we communicated with the centers in China of our federation. They were already doing this treatment, but not in a randomized, not in a controlled way. And we were already approved by the FDA for testing these cells in type 1 diabetes, and we were doing it in Alzheimer's. And so we were able to, within a week, we got approval from FDA to perform this transplant in the most severe cases of COVID. And the results have been just published a few days ago in Stem Cell Translational Medicine, how umbilical cord mesenchymal stem cells that have all these properties of modulating inflammation, the immune system, and the cytokine storm, and they have many other beneficial properties. When you infuse them, you obtain them from an umbilical cord of a healthy newborn baby. They're very immature cells with a lot of these properties, and we try to determine first if it was safe, and then see if it was effective in this double blind, meaning patients and doctor didn't know who was taking the cells and who was taking a control solution. And the results have been quite dramatic. It was associated with a significantly improved patient survival and time to recovery, 91% survival in the stem cell group in green versus 42% in the control group at 1 month. The majority of patients recover within 2 weeks after the stem cell infusion, while the ones that were still alive most of them were still in the hospital at 1 month. So if you look at the age less than 85 years, 100% patient survival, the one receiving the stem cells. And these are all acute cases, ICU, here, acute respiratory distress syndrome, so very severe cases. So it showed that it's beneficial, and now we have to bring this pilot, this new finding to validation with large multi-center trials. And here start the complexity, what I will address at the end, the value of death between the first value of death that has been described between basic science and doing the first clinical trial. But then you have more critical value of death when you try to translate these findings to the general population and do larger trial, validation trial, phase 3 trial, so-called. And then the other concept is that if you have indication, okay, if you modulate inflammation and you modulate the immune system, you can treat the most severe cases, but what can we do to prevent them? So now our focus is shifting also on prevention and improving lifespan, and similar strategies that are used like to try to improve healthy lifespan are similar to the one that we are trying to prevent or halt progression of autoimmunity, and are emerging very importantly as critically important to try to prevent or mitigate the progression of viral disease such as COVID-19. This is such an important problem because healthcare costs are reaching costs that are unsustainable. In the United States, we're talking 3.5 trillion a year, or approximately 20% of the GDP of the United States. And most of these costs, 90% of them, are related to treating chronic disease conditions. So what we've been studying is how we have evolved to promote these chronic diseases that are very much also related to the diet and lifestyle that have been developing in the past decades. And we don't have time to enter in all the concepts, but we have a decrease of protective factor like omega-3, polyphenols, vitamin D, exercise and fitness, less and less more hours in front of computer or television, where we're increasing factors that may be damaging, like omega-6, the high consumption of red meat and refined carbohydrates and processed foods. So we are now moving to a phase where we're trying to see, can we use protective factors? And just today they sent me an article saying that higher omega-3 protects from severe COVID. And weeks ago there have been papers on vitamin D insufficiency, how is related to the most severe cases of COVID. So clearly there are signs emerging that will have still to be validated by larger randomized prospective trials. But when you're dealing with an emergency like COVID-19 and a pandemic, you also have to start trusting science and common sense and wellness medicine in parallel to evidence-based medicine. So the idea is like, let's try to do with what is common sense and what we think can help without hurting patients, but at the same time, remembering that all these results will have to be validated by much larger trials. And at the end, I would just like to mention that to computational screening of chemical libraries with over 687 million compounds are emerging also natural substances in addition to vitamin D, like quercetin, polyphenols, activators of sirtuins, omega-3 that can help us mitigating this process. And we created a network. This is very important for our future effort, at least here and in Europe, with collaborators in Italy, that is called Fit for Pandemic, to try to understand how bats have evolved to modulate their immune and inflammatory responses to viral infections over 70, 80 million of years, and how we can learn and try to identify protective substances and lifestyle and dietary nutrition and protective substances that you can add to try to learn from bats and become more resistant to this pandemic. So this has been very interesting. There are new data emerging. You'll read papers very soon. There are like sirtuin activators like polytadine, pterostilbenonochiol, that in addition to vitamin D and omega-3 are showing a very powerful mitigation of viral infection effect. And I think so that therefore we have to keep an eye to innovative approaches, but we also have to look more at prevention and besides cure, because in a way there is no cure without prevention. Like you cannot just cure something and then don't prevent recurrence of the disease. And even in COVID, patients that are survivor of COVID, now there are problems of sequelae and side effect long-term after you recover. So that's why we have to invest. It's difficult to invest in prevention because there is no $1 billion to be made immediately. But for the healthcare economic of a nation, it's critically important, because if you add 2 years of healthy lifespan to the population, you save in the United States alone $7 trillion that you could invest for global warming, hunger, other problem to save the world. But the cost of healthcare related to disease that can be preventable should make us really think how we can define better strategy to prevent disease instead or in addition to curing the most severe cases. And here is just show that the critical challenges that we have in science is not just the translation of basic biomedical research to clinical science and knowledge, to do a clinical trial, but is then you have this second that to me is even more challenging value of death. That is, how do you translate the early results like we had now in COVID, thanks to the contribution of the Cure Alliance and North American Building Trade Unions and others that allow to carry forward the nonprofit academic collaborative international initiative. But now, how do we do a phase 3 trial that typically require a corporation or big dollars that we don't have readily available? So that is a big challenge, because now also the regulatory requirements are becoming more and more complex, and the regulatory bar is increasing, sometimes rightly so, to protect the patient safety, but in a way is imposing cost to translation that are unsustainable by academic institution and non-profit entity or academic clinicians. And so that more and more it is in the hands of corporation and big pharma to decide what disease, who and when it will be treated. So there are many value of death, but so it's the challenge that I see is that by giving the same attention to bridging science policies value of death as we do with biomedical research and translational process, we could have a prospect can be favorable for the effective translation of science in collective benefit. So just to link to what we were saying, well, I'm thanking all the amazing collaborators that we have in these projects, but to link it with the theme that we were discussing before is really a challenge that we are trying to overcome through international collaboration, open access, sharing protocol. At least in the non-profit world is a little easier to develop things without so much secrecy, but also how to promote and continue to welcome innovation while in parallel trying to validate the claim with rigorous clinical trial. This is my view from above the Alps.
Dr. Camillo Ricordi, Camillo, it was really enlightening and very deep and profound. At the same time, it's and we perceive the hope. The hope is like there is room for bringing, like to humanity a new treatment and complementarity approach that will, like whether prevent or will support faster recovery. So there are multiple ways and rooms for hope. So let's maybe, like start the Q&A session. If on the technical team we can kindly bring us our two other speakers. So first of all, thank you very much. And I think you understood now the order of intervention. We wanted, like to have the perspective in different angles on that topic. And that topic is actually now at the center of every family. It's at the center of every human being. And so the first question for all of you will be, is there room for hope? Is there room for hope? That's what people are asking us, and that's what people want to go, like sleeping on. Is there room for hope? Are we going to see the end of the pandemic? And is it going to be done in a way which will be harmonized, which is over the planet? Or are we going to expect some area where it will disappear and it will continue on other parts of the world? So are we going to be able to end the pandemic and doing it in a way which will be inclusive? On that, I would like to see, like first of all, Magnus, what are your thoughts from the institutional aspect and organization like UNESCO?
Well, I will focus on the inclusive part to your question. And here we know that we're really not seeing the world coming together as we could expect or would hope. Of course, there's been a great collaboration among scientists that is unique in sharing data and kind of really practicing open science. I think that might have effects in a positive way for the future in terms of scientific cooperation, which is one dimension of UNESCO's work. However, at the same time, we're seeing very practical dimensions where the vaccines are being not delivered to parts of the world for reasons related to lower income situations or other dimensions. And this creates, of course, two worlds that could be further exacerbated by this crisis. We already have a low-income, middle-income, middle-low-income, and so on world where we've been doing some pretty good progress in the last years, some amazing progress actually, in some areas of the Sustainable Development Goals. But now we're seeing a backtracking due to the virus, both in terms of health indicators, not just related to the actual COVID-19, but other dimensions that are being prevented from being treated or prevented in terms of vaccine deliveries and so on. Who knows if this crisis actually will be seen as, something preventing to eliminate polio, for example, because we were almost there. But now with this crisis and not being able to move around to the last parts of the world where polio still exists, mainly in Afghanistan and Pakistan, on the border, maybe we don't even know, I think, at this time. Right? So this is just one of many examples where other diseases are coming back and other, so to speak, quasi-diseases like, poverty, you can call it that, in a world that is affluent otherwise. And how do we deal with this without working more closely together in multilateral dimensions? Nobody has the answer. So I think this is where we need to make a push now. We can't have a situation where some rich countries, reduce their aid budgets in this situation, right? Which is happening, right? And at the same time, we need to be clear from the international community side and from the kind of North-South cooperation that we know much more what works today than we did 10, 15 years ago. We have much better control of impact and reporting back on those interventions. And therefore, money is spent in a much safer way. It's a great investment to invest in development cooperation, and it's more important than ever. So the inequalities are being expanded based on the pandemic. They were already there, but now we see them becoming more severe. So this is a very big challenge, and the SDGs will not be achieved, most of them, partly because of the pandemic as it looks right now. So, the world needs to come together. We need to take action. We need to step up our willingness to give from our wealthy part of the world to those that don't have the wealth. The systems are much better than they've ever been to do so. So what's preventing us from doing that? That's my contribution to this question.
Jonathan disappeared for a moment, so maybe we can continue. Konstantinos, if you want to.
Yes, I mean, I don't know. I guess people are working on the technical part in the background.
Why don't you take it away?
What I can say is that, I can only talk about the research part, and I can say that it was an enormous effort from the moment that the scientific community realized how huge this is going to be for humanity. The speed and rigor of identifying the virus, sequencing the whole genome, identifying the important proteins, developing vaccines, and working in parallel on a number of potential antiviral drugs, that my guess would be that this is something that is also going to happen in the next year or two. This was an amazing effort, and I think this is also, in brackets, like a great exercise for the scientific community on how to respond fast and efficiently to such. Hi, Jonathan. Nice to see you back.
Yes.
With the freedom of continuing with your question. So I was just saying that this whole thing can be seen also as an important exercise, in brackets, for the scientific community on how to address similar issues in the future and how to respond in a fast and coordinated way to these very big challenges. And the example is, I would say, quite successful given the time that has passed. Like it is less than a year actually that people started working on that. I have seen labs with that have a completely different focus otherwise, dropping all of their research and switching completely to COVID-related research and providing valuable data to the scientific community in an open and transparent way. So I think that science has responded quite well to this part. Of course, like Mr. Magnusson has already explained to us, this is not enough, and we have issues of distribution and issues of inclusivity and financial issues. So these are things that are going to be the next challenges for this pandemic and for whatever similar might come up in the future.
Yeah, and if I may add, I think that these are all very important themes, but I see the opportunity is in promoting really international collaboration and unity, that both at the political level and the scientific level. And we see so many bad examples that produce catastrophic outcome. Like I take the United States, for example, where you have, if you wear a mask, you're Democrat. If you don't wear a mask, you're Republican. Misinformation, and witch hunt to people that can say something that maybe is not in the standard of one party or the other at the political level. At the scientific also, like I see in Italy, there have been furious battle between virologists on one side, on the other, and intensive care specialists. Instead of working together, saying, accepting the difference in opinion while you try to validate. And maybe the most important thing is that while you promote this international collaboration and transparency, you have also to avoid selective reporting, so that it's difficult when you're in the for-profit world, because maybe a pharmaceutical company or a corporation for profit may want to show good results, otherwise the stock value or other parameters may vary. But in the academic work, we should have that as you go forward with a trial or with an approach, instant reporting live of all and not of the cases that just do well or the positive results, because you can learn a lot from negative results. There shouldn't be a fear to report side effect of one vaccine or the other. And to me, it's not just vaccination that solved the pandemic, because what is emerging is that you can really shift the population more and more towards the asymptomatic or pouch-symptomatic cases of COVID, just looking at protective factors and how to avoid the predisposition that incidentally is emerging, like being the same predisposition to the autoimmune epidemic that now affect 20% of the population in the United States with 100 different diseases, have similar basis of lack of regulatory T cells and lack of ability to modulate the immune system and inflammatory reaction that are very similar to what we see in these most severe cases of COVID, where they have low omega-3, low vitamin D, low activators of sirtuin. So it's really key to keep an open mind, because we are learning as we go. I remember I'm a member of the Consiglio Superiore della Sanità in Italy, also besides in the United States. And at the beginning, there was complete confusion. Like we were having our collaborator in China were saying, wear mask, there is aerial transmission. And we had people instead from the WHO coming to our meeting saying there is no aerial transmission, the masks are useless. And so we are learning as we... So instead of pointing finger or having this incredible fight at the political or scientific level, we should learn to be more collaborative and also more transparent.
Thank you, Camillo, on that. You mentioned something earlier, which is about the preventive aspect of it, and that is as well an element which is at multiple levels. It is at an educational level. And UNESCO can be sharing an aspect of that. It is, as well in the sharing of the passion for research. That's what has brought you, Konstantinos, to become, a scientist, scientific in molecular research, and it can be as well in treatment. So, what are and what is the aspect of prevention, and how could we learn from now what's happening and support having the right policy, the right investment for supportive of the research of tomorrow that will be able, to maintain a higher capability of reactions, because prevention will be, in higher conditions and respect.
Well, I think it's very important. This is a non-profit open access site that we started collaboratively, the fitforpandemic.com. Is fit with the number 4 pandemic, where we put evidence as it is coming out. Like today, this morning, we just added this new paper on omega-3 levels, how they relate to less severe cases of COVID-19. If you have higher fish oil, and vitamin D, same. Polyphenols and activators of sirtuin, we're putting evidence after evidence. But the important thing is that when you're dealing with products that are generic and they cost nothing, like vitamin D, I think is $1 a week the cost, then there is no billion or $1 trillion profit to be made. It's more difficult to get funding, at least from some sources, and that is how critically important are organizations like UNESCO, WHO, governments to promote efforts, collaborative efforts for prevention, because it is very difficult to get funding in this direction. Like it is improving slightly, the situation at NIH, but is more and more like curing diseases. How if a disease doesn't become severe, like if you have spinal cord injury, you're paralyzed, or you have cancer, it's easier to get funding for non-profit initiative. But if you say, I want to prevent severe cases of viral infection and makes instead of 90% of the population immune or protect, I want to avoid those 10% of severe cases, is much more difficult.
Very good.
I hope Bill Gates or someone is hearing and will say, okay, I'll send you a check.
I think the message will pass. Magnus, what are your thoughts on prevention?
No, well, I of course fully agree with what just was said, and this is actually an area where the Gates Foundation has done a lot of good. And I have a background from the foundation, but I'm not there right now. But I just want to say, I think private foundations can step up in this direction and take risks that sometimes is hard to do for even public organizations. So it's not necessarily just the case that originally commercially based organizations that then propel into a different role are not useful. The Gates Foundation has, in fact, I think, done an incredible amount of good in terms of allowing scientists to fail in different tracks of development, which is one way to contribute, because then others don't have to go down that road. For example, on tuberculosis, where we still don't have a cure, right, or a treatment or prevention, right? So to be able to put money at risk for diseases that are considered investigated, very often tropical diseases that we don't have in the rich part of the world. Typically, we need more players like the foundation to go into that space, because suddenly they're with us, right? And I think climate change makes that happen, but it's not the only reason. The other reason, obviously, is because it's the right thing to do, right? And it comes back to the ethical dimension. So this is a different discussion, what kind of money goes for what kind of risks. But I want to also say, in terms of prevention, I think the echo chambers that social media have provided, we mostly see as something very negative. And I certainly agree. But as I made the link to the paradigm shift process of science, those are also, in a way, echo chambers, right? And we've seen in science history how those have been very hard to break, like the Earth is flat, and scientists were probably killed because they argued it wasn't, right? So I think this phenomenon of human behavior, how we manage our self-conscious minds, I think we all need to take a good reflection on, right? And my theory of kind of development, of evolution of societies, and this is just a hopeful theory in a way, but what if these echo chambers pop one after the other? I mean, a couple of them probably popped in the last months or so, because of political changes and less of leaders, denying science and spreading, unfactual or even lies, disinformation. Once that stops, some chambers pop, right? But I think the fact that people engage online, search for facts, their facts that support their views, and then they realize it's not true because there's too many other facts they find eventually, is in a way a kind of public science process, right? You learn, right? It doesn't have to be just science. I think this actually could actually contribute to bringing us closer to the knowledge society. but of many risks and many hurdles. And leadership is extremely important, because obviously if you have leaders that try to misuse the echo chambers or use it for their purpose to spread hatred or not collaborate and so on, then of course, there's risks. But I think generally, the world has a huge opportunity to transcend because of the online knowledge access, and people to find themselves popping out of their echo chambers as time goes by, because they continue to be active online. But this is a hopeful theory. I mean, it could all be wrong. I think we have to be very clear and take leadership on what is allowed. I think what's not allowed outside of the internet shouldn't be allowed on the internet. I think this is what the EU leadership has just said. This is my personal opinion. But I think, and maybe just a final point about UNESCO's role. Yes, of course, we want to do all we can, and we are doing a lot to try to convince governments to realize that open science, contributes to development of societies, of prosperity, of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, focusing on domestic technology, innovations, and science systems as a very important part of a development strategy, and not just hope science will come from somebody else. Make sure also scientists in your country are supported and have access to the networks, are able to travel, are not being pushed to do research on these things but not these things, right? The scientific freedom, or some call it academic freedom, but the UN word is scientific freedom, dimensions need to be supported and pushed forward, which we're doing actively and with our 193 member states. It's a long process, and it builds on getting agreements and slowly moving forward. But forward we must go, and there is one important step we took 3 years ago, and that's the recommendation on the status of science and scientific researchers. The recommendation is the second level out of 3 in terms of binding international standard-setting instruments at UNESCO. This one is being implemented by the 193 member states. They report to us in a structured way. We've put into place support programs that help those countries requesting our support to be able to move on these recommendations, to make sure science is being conducted with all the dimensions required, both funding, practical, freedom, and so on, to be able to support the development strategies of these countries. Thanks.
Magnus, thank you very much. Konstantinos, to get your vision on that.
I need to leave in 1 minute or two, actually. I have another call, but in a very telegraphic way. On prevention, it's true that we need to act before rather than searching for solutions after. And we need to generate a culture. We already know how bad smoking is, but there are lots of people still smoking. We know how bad Western diet is, and this is still out there and is actually being advertised, and lots of people are still into this. So we need to generate a culture that in families, that parents should be aware of that, and generating a culture, educating their children. And on the second topic, on scientific freedom, this is a huge discussion there. The only thing I have to say is that scientific community is still very grateful for funding sources like the Max Planck Society or the European Research Council, funding sources that promote basic research, that promote ideas, that you do not require, it's not required to have something applied or translational or something that would be directly translational. So we need to build the knowledge based on which 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we would be able to reach new therapies. So the RNA vaccines, we wouldn't be able to achieve what we achieved so fast if this wasn't there, if all the research was not there for 20 or 30 years before. So that's all what I have to say. I think that it's super important to continue promoting basic science and generating a culture for people to take precautions and taking preventative measures instead of looking for a cure afterwards. That's faster, that's cheaper, and that's more efficient.
Konstantinos, thank you very much. And if each of our speakers in less than 1 minute could just share a last word to citizens of the world listening to us, a message of hope, what will be your message, Camilo?
My message is that there is so much emerging from the scientific collaborative efforts worldwide beyond vaccine, and I think that also having a healthier lifestyle, nutrition, and taking protective substances will play a critical role in trying to make us less prone to hyperimmune, hyperinflammatory reaction like the autoimmune epidemics or severe viral reaction to viral infection. If you lack these protective substances and you're predisposed to be unable to react and modulate the immune system, you may have in type 1 diabetes could be an enterovirus, and then you develop an autoimmunity against your insulin-secreting cells. In SARS-CoV-2 can be COVID-19, and you develop a severe cases because if you no longer have your regulatory T cells and your system to modulate the immune system, you may be less protected against some of these deadly complications. And I think there is so much that we can do becoming fit for pandemic and learning from bats in a way, in addition to the RNA vaccine and other vaccines that are emerging. So I'm really hopeful in this direction.
Thank you very much. Konstantinos.
Yes, I really need to disconnect now. So my last words for this session are, trust science, look for the right sources to collect information, and when you don't know where to look for, ask people in your environment that can guide you through the process.
Thank you, Konstantinos.
And I would like to thank you for having me. I apologize, but I have to leave you now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Konstantinos.
Yes, well, let me just say, I would encourage everybody to seek the pleasure in questioning your echo chambers, right? Regardless of who we are, and find, I think, that wonderful experience every day of knowing something new, or learning something new, and actually changing your mind. And there's many ways you can do that nowadays. One good start is to find a very solid, plausible source of information on scientific research. I'm not going to name any names, but you can find it, and it's wonderful to get that in your feed every day on whatever you use in terms of platforms, and that brings a lot of hope, clearly. But remember also those that are not in the same position as us, that do not have access to the internet, and live in societies that are low income, for historical reasons don't have the opportunities we do. Feel passion towards them as well, and share whatever you can in terms of your financial resources, your knowledge, and in your time, and make sure that the world moves together forward as one. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Magnus. I think we had a great session. Issue.
You're breaking up.
I would like to thank our three change makers. Great pleasure to see you again, and let's hope and let's pray science and us people will be able to find ways to navigate those challenging waters and build the solutions. As you say, Camilo, we have to start now to build the solutions that will save us tomorrow. So thank you very much all, and looking forward to the continuation of our exchange. All the best.
Thank you. Best.
Thank you.
Congratulations.